This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good evening and a very warm welcome. My name is Kate Day. I am Deputy Editor-in-Chief for Politico in Europe. And what a day. I would love to say this was all planned as I drew up our expansion. Sadly it wasn't, but we are delighted to have Ed Miliband with us, and I promise I won't keep you from him. I'd like to tell you just briefly a little bit about our expansion in the UK this year. It's been an exciting year. We've gone from 18 journalists back in December to now almost 40. I think we're at 39, and my latest count by the end of the year will be well past 40. So it's been a fun time and a really exciting year to get into expanding our journalism and our coverage of Westminster. Under the leadership of Jack Blanchard, who many of you know, used to write London Playbook and present Westminster Insider, and now edits all of our coverage here in London. We've brought this ever-expanding team to the West End recently. We've got an office just over the road now and a much bigger newsroom, so we're starting to feel like we're really accelerating our presence here. One of our secret weapons and one of the opportunities we spotted in the UK is our coverage of policy, and that's partly what tonight is all about, celebrating the launch of Pro Energy and Climate UK, our latest policy vertical, as we call them. We felt there was a real opportunity in Britain in particular, as we've seen in Washington and in Brussels, to cover politics and policy in a slightly different way, to bring the two together, to really seriously look at policy in a non-partisan and still quite fun and lively and engaging form. And we've recruited a wonderful team, one of whom is probably a familiar face, Charlie Cooper, who covered Brexit for us and was our chief UK correspondent. He's now helming our coverage of energy and climate as our lead reporter. Under the watchful eye of Russell Hargrave, who's a new face, has joined Politico to edit this product, and alongside the fantastic Abby Wallace, who is another of our reporters, we've got somebody else joining the team soon, so that is one of our growing areas. And we've also expanded our Playbook team this year. We've rolled out other policy coverage, including tech and trade. Next up is financial services, so look out for that. We'll have that in November. And we're also expanding our audio offer. We've recently recruited Anne McElvoy from The Economist. She's about to launch a new show this week with us, and we have more podcasts coming soon. So lots going on. We couldn't be more excited, and we really hope you enjoy this evening, both the conversation, which I'm sure will be fascinating, especially today, but also a drink afterwards. So thank you very much for all of you who read us and partner with us. And on that note, I'd like to particularly thank SSE and welcome to the stage Alistair Phillips-Davies, who's SSE's CEO and our partner tonight. Thank you very much, Alistair.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you all for coming tonight. I suspect there was a few late RSVPs on the back of what proves to be an interesting day, and I suspect we'll see some fantastic coverage from it a little bit later on. We're pleased to be supporting today's event. We're pleased to have sponsored it and help Politico just after they've launched their new energy and climate newsletter. This issue is hugely important and obviously hugely important to us, and it's great to make sure that we keep politicians, policymakers and stakeholders well informed on what the issues of the day are. For those of us, or for those of you who don't know us, SSE is building more offshore wind than any other company in the world right now, and right here in the UK. We consider ourselves the UK's clean energy champion. We're not only doing that, we're transforming electricity grids to bring all that clean, homegrown energy to where it is needed most. We're pioneering CCS and hydrogen. We're also looking to build one of Europe's biggest pump storage facilities in decades to keep the lights on when the wind isn't blowing and when the sun isn't shining. And we're creating thousands of good jobs from Shetland all the way down to the Isle of Wight. We're hoping to invest £40 billion over the next decade, far more than we'll be earning in profits, and a massive commitment and hopefully boost to the energy security sector in the UK, as well as delivering on climate change targets. It's one of the largest investment programs this country has ever seen. And as a UK-listed company, we're extremely proud to be leading that energy transition. I think there are headwinds, and they've certainly picked up over the last 6 months or so. The impact of Ukraine, the challenging economic picture, the impact of the fiscal stimulus in the US, and indeed the response of the EU most recently last week. All that resulted in what was a difficult auction round last week, I suppose, when no bids were seen for offshore wind projects. It was very good for onshore wind, and we're delighted we were one of the big winners with over 600 megawatts of new onshore, but certainly there are a lot of headwinds there. And we've all seen today, well, I didn't actually because I was on a train trying to get here, but I'm told that there was a big government announcement today where they're considering, in the words of, I'll quote somebody else rather than myself, rowing back on some net zero commitments. These are undoubtedly interesting times. Policy areas like this are going to be tough. We need to make tough choices. We need to stay the course. We can't shy away from those. Uncertainty and things of that nature will deter investment, and therefore being brave and staying the course is important. Again, I'm sure we'll hear more of that later. I think there is one thing we can all agree on now, and that is that clean power will be an enabler of net zero, and we need to crack on with building it at large scale. There's lots of companies like ours who want to invest in whether it's wind infrastructure, network infrastructure, flexible green infrastructure. And by demonstrating ambition in these areas, governments of any colour can show that they're serious about clean energy infrastructure and can send a clear signal to industry and investors that the UK is open for that investment. It's not just about climate. The UK has a huge economic opportunity. We can lower the cost of energy currently by investing in many of these technologies. We can increase our security of supply by having control of that rather than importing things from far away. And we can attract a lot of investment and create a lot of green jobs here in the UK. But having the policy behind that is important. I'm an optimist on all that, so I believe we'll get there. I think there are 4 things that I think we need to do to maintain investor confidence in the UK by bringing forward policies which give developers certainty, to make sure the UK is the easiest place in the world to invest in clean energy infrastructure. We will need successful AR6 and AR7 rounds. That's the next rounds for offshore wind if we're going to hit our 2030 targets. We need to accelerate delivery of national critical infrastructure, such as networks. We need to ensure that there is sufficient capacity across new generation, and we need to get on with building flexible and flexibility and storage across the UK to make sure it complements the renewables that we've got. I mean, to close, the level of investment we would like to make is only possible because of partnerships. And here today we have policymakers, officials, and partners who will play a vital role in building the clean, secure, homegrown energy system we all want. So I'd now like to hand over to Politico's Jack Blanchard, who'll be interviewing Ed Miliband. Ed, I've known for a long time, and he's someone who has demonstrated ambition and leadership on climate change and clean energy for many years now. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say about the events of today and going forward. Thank you.
Have a seat. Hello, thanks all for coming. My name's Jack Blanchard. I'm the UK editor here at Politico. Some of you might remember my emails from a few years ago that used to bother you at 7 o'clock in the morning. You're about to see me in a new form in a joint podcast that we're launching next Sunday in a partnership with Sky, which I'll just take the opportunity to plug here. With my friend Sam Coates, we'll be making a Sunday night sort of briefing show where we kind of predict for you all what's going to happen in the week ahead. And there'll be certain weeks like this one where we'll make complete fools of ourselves. We made a pilot on Sunday, which will hopefully never see the light of day. It did not predict a significant change, rollback, U-turn, however you want to call it, of green policies that we've all watched happen today. But from a journalism point of view, I'm delighted it's happened because we have on stage Ed Miliband to talk about it. I first interviewed Ed, by the way, way back in like 2008 when I was at the Yorkshire Post, and Ed, to me, was the MP for Doncaster Central, which...
North.
Oh, God, it's been a long time. Is that Rosie Winterton? Oh, man. I didn't last long at the Yorkshire Post. Yeah, exactly. But you were always very generous with your time then, Ed, and I seem to remember asking you, you know, you were the Energy Secretary then, you know, what were your ambitions for the future, and you said you wanted to be Energy Secretary for a very long time. And so who knows, 2024, 2025, you could be back for another go at it. We've got to start, though, on the events of today. Ed, you've watched the Prime Minister announce a watering down, you might call it, of policies on net zero. Were you surprised by what you saw?
Look, I'm disappointed for the country because I think what the country needs is ambition, consistency, and a sense of a plan. And I think for the businesses in this room and the businesses across the country, and you've seen the reaction from business, I don't know how you would plan on the basis of what this government is offering from one week to the next, from one day to the next, from 1 month to the next. And so the sort of first problem is just the inconsistency in the sense of chopping and changing, which the Treasury's own net zero review said was the biggest enemy of investment. I think the second problem is, and this is a big philosophical difference, I think, between us and the Conservatives, is I think the Prime Minister, and this is unlike at least 3 of his predecessors, I think he simply sees not net zero as an obligation to be managed, not an opportunity to be seized. And that is the way he behaved at the Treasury, and that is the way he's behaving as Prime Minister, and that is what we saw from him today. And if we only see it as an obligation to be managed, not an opportunity to be seized, I think we will lose in the global race for jobs. I think it will be bad for people's bills, and I think it will load more costs onto people. And I'm afraid in the end, that is what today does. I just take this 2030 ICE phase out, the petrol and diesel new car phase out. I mean, look, I'm a guy who goes on the evidence. And if you look at the Climate Change Committee's 6th carbon budget report, it tells you that the 2030 phase out date saves billions of pounds across our economy. Today's measure isn't cost reducing, it is cost raising for families across Britain. And I'm afraid, I think what Rishi Sunak has done has sort of given in to a skeptical sect in his party who think, let's just scale everything back, delay, dither is somehow the answer. It isn't. It is selling Britain short, it is selling Britain down the river.
Can we just be clear, how many of the policy changes we heard today would Labour oppose? How many will you
God,
reverse?
it's hard to keep... I think a lot of them seem to be made up, actually, some of the policies. I'm not introducing 14 bins for people or something. Yeah. We're not in favour of 14 bins or 7 bins. Well, look, let's start with the biggest ticket item, which is 2030 and the petrol and diesel phase out. We're going to stick to what was the government's policy yesterday, which is the phase out of new petrol and diesel cars being sold on the road in 2030 with the 2035 date for hybrids. I thought that was the right policy. Industry's planned on that basis. Industry's invested billions of pounds on that basis. The market is being set up on that basis. Now, I think there's a point here, which is Rishi Sunak sort of admitted today that they had done a bad job on the charging infrastructure. That isn't a reason to abandon the plan. That's a reason to work with the industry to make sure we put the charging infrastructure in place. You know, I just can't look investors in the eye in Britain and who are investing on, you know, for this 2030 date and say, okay, you know, we're just going to sort of chop and change. I mean, you know, consistency is what we need, so we're going to stick to that.
What about an exemption for some homes on the gas boiler phase out? That's sensible, isn't it? If you can't make clean tech work.
I mean, look, we're going to have to look at that. And let me just sort of tell you my thoughts on this. I mean, what I'm not going to do is sign up to a sort of failed government target. I think the problem we've got on heat pumps, frankly, is we've got the lowest take-up in Europe. We haven't got a plan in place, and we will only implement the phase out when we know that working people can be better off. So I've got a slightly different view on that than I've got on the petrol and diesel phase out. What we will do is, in government, we will set out a plan, and I just emphasize this point, Jack, a plan to get down the cost of heat pumps and to make sure it works for people economically.
Home efficiency regulations?
Is this about the private landlords?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in favour of what was the government's policy yesterday. The private rented sector. Look, we know energy efficient. We have the worst insulated homes in Europe, right? And we know energy efficiency ever since cut the green crap, when David Cameron said cut the green crap. We know energy efficiency has been a total disaster. Energy efficiency levels are something like 90% lower. Energy insulation measures are 90% lower than they were in 2010. We can't start abandoning a sort of sensible energy efficiency measure. We've got to, as part of our $6 billion a year commitment in relation to home insulation, we'll look at finding ways to help, all homeowners to make this transition. But this is, by the way, Rishi Sunak is saying this is going to be bad for renters. This is going to be good for renters to upgrade homes. Okay. Because it's going to actually cut people's bills.
So you're opposed to that one. You're opposed to the petrol car change. Yeah. Gas boilers, wait and see for the detail.
Well, I think on gas boilers, we will set out a plan in government with a date by which it's going to work.
He mentioned some more random stuff as well. You talked about the bins.
Very random.
What did you think about what he said about diet and how, like, a pledge?
I mean, look, let me tell you, even the vegan society aren't in favour of a meat tax. I'm certainly not in favour of a meat tax. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's a sort of, I think Simon Clarke said it's like, a number of straw men kind of walked into the room. I mean, I'm not in favour of a meat tax. Of course.
There's a serious point there.
There is a, no,
we do need to tackle farming and diet, do we?
Give people information. Well, the thing that the government refuses to do is just give people information about balanced diets and all of that. But it's for people to decide what they eat. Of course it is. But look, I think there's a wider point here, which is this. We've got to ask ourselves, why are we in this position? And the reason we're in this position, I think a lot of it goes back to the Treasury and the way Rishi Sunak ran the Treasury. A lot of areas for net zero, the costs are lower. Green energy, the costs are lower. I mean, you wouldn't have known it from Rishi Sunak today, but if we move to renewables, we'll cut costs. The disaster of AR5 means we're going to have to pay higher bills. But there are areas where there are costs. Now, how do you spread those costs fairly? By government playing a role in terms of public investment. And that's what the Treasury has refused to do. And so, look, we can wait as long as we like for a Conservative government, but they're never going to implement this change fairly because they're basically going to let the cost fall on ordinary people. Why? Because they don't believe in the measures to make this fair, because they don't think it's the role of government to do that. And that's what will be different, one of the things that will be different with us, which is there are areas where it's cheaper and we're going to go hell for leather, green sprint and all that. There are other areas where there are costs. We'll spread those costs fairly and we'll make sure working people are better off. And if this transition, who do you trust? I think our message at the election will be to the British people. Who do you really trust to make this fair for you? Do you trust a Conservative government that's going to load the costs onto you? In the end, they're going to load the costs onto you, or they're not going to do it, and that will throw up bigger costs for the future, or a Labour government that is going to make those costs fair, including through government investment.
I'm not certain people will buy that message. Rishi Sunak stands up today, and he says, how can it be right that British citizens are asked to make more sacrifices now when Britain is already way ahead of the game compared to lots of comparator countries? And people might hear that message and think that's right, and hear your plans, big spending plans, things that eventually the public have to pay for, and think maybe that's right. Maybe we don't need to go as fast.
There's no question about it that if we delay action on climate, we increase the costs. Don't take my word for it. Take the OBR's word for it, Office of Budget Responsibility. I strongly recommend their 2 long-term fiscal risks reports, if you haven't read them. It's excellent Ed Miliband bedtime reading. And what they show is that delay by a decade doubles the cost of the transition. So let's not fall for this nonsense that somehow delay and dither is going to reduce the cost. It's going to increase the costs. And I just go back to this offshore wind auction because I think you raised the point, Jack, and I think it is really important because this is different from when you were at the Yorkshire Post 15 years ago and you didn't know my constituency.
I knew it then. I definitely knew it then.
Because renewables are significantly cheaper than fossil fuels. And I'm going to say this a lot over the coming months because it's really, really important to get this point across. So why does Renewable UK say the cost of the failure of the auction is £2 billion on bills? Because it's £2 billion the way we're going to be having to use expensive fossil fuels rather than renewables. So, let's not fall for the idea that delay, I mean, this is so confusing about Rishi Sunak's thing that it was about big long-term decisions. It wasn't about big long-term decisions. It was about short-term, desperate measures from a pretty desperate prime minister who, the idea that sort of Liz Truss is running the table on government policy, Liz Truss says something on Monday and it gets announced on Wednesday by this government. I mean, it tells you all you need to know, really.
But nevertheless, you can feel the politics around net zero shifting, the arguments moving around. We saw what happened.
You can see the prime minister moving around. Yeah.
Well, we saw the public in Uxbridge vote heavily and unexpectedly against an anti-pollution measure that you can broadly put into this bracket. Did that not make you stop and think about, are we actually taking the public with us with these kind of measures?
We
that was,
absolutely
of course,
going to take the public with us. And look, that's why for 3 and a bit years we have painstakingly designed an agenda which is going to cut costs for ordinary people and tackle the cost of living crisis.
But that's not how people saw it in Uxbridge, with the ULEZ particularly, was it?
Well, look, ULEZ was a measure that the government sort of pushed Sadiq Khan to do, which Sadiq did. I don't have a proposal for ULEZ. That's not our plan. What we are about is cutting costs for people and tackling the cost of living crisis. I firmly believe, and that's why our concentration on clean power is so important, that by getting to zero carbon power by 2030, we've got independent analysis from Envoy showing this, we will cut bills for people, and our watchword will be to tackle the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis together, and I'm absolutely convinced we can, and we do it in 2 particular ways, certain areas where it's cheaper, other areas, which is really, really important, where we create good jobs for people, which are also the kind of long-term way, as Keir Starmer would say, not the sticking plaster way, but the long-term way to tackle the cost of living crisis.
It felt like a sort of the start of the election campaign today to me, watching it, seeing Rishi Sunak with the lectern policy announcement. He obviously thinks...
I don't think that was the way it was planned, but anyway...
Well, okay, yeah. A rushed forward start, but nevertheless, he obviously sees this as a dividing line that he can draw between Labour. You're clearly drawing that line yourself here today. Could the next election become a sort of referendum on net zero?
Look, he's a sort of desperate guy, isn't he? I mean,
But don't you worry that the public might buy this argument?
Well, see, the interesting thing is, if you talk to all of the people who look at these things, if you look at the More in Common polling, for example, the public are really smart about this. The public are very in favour of tackling the climate emergency because they see it as a route to good jobs for the future. They see it as protecting their kids, and they want to make sure that it works for them economically. And I think what I'm saying to you very clearly, Jack, is that I relish the prospect of going toe-to-toe with this government on saying who can make this transition work economically for the British people. Because the idea that Rishi Sunak, who is seen as out of touch, who's delivered the biggest cost of living crisis in a generation, is the answer to the question of who is going to implement the green transition in a fair way. I mean, come off it, frankly.
You talk about taking working people with you. Did you read Gary Smith, the head of the GMB Union this week, saying that we've cut carbon emissions by decimating working class communities?
So I talked to Gary a lot, and look, Gary's point in particular is this, which is, are we going to create the good jobs at decent wages, which the Tories have promised in relation to the renewables transition, and the SNP promised and haven't been delivered? And that's why GB Energy, our National Wealth Fund, understanding what the Biden administration is doing in the US, that's why those things are so important. And this is what gets me about today, because we need the private investment in Britain to create these jobs. We need business to know that policy is not going to change day to day, week to week, month to month. They need to know a North Star. I know what our North Star is going to be if I'm the Secretary of State, if we win the election and I'm the Secretary of State, which is 2030 clean power. And we will, and my work with my team is to have a day one plan to make it happen. And, one of the things I'm spending a lot of my time doing is talking to business about how do we make this happen? How do we make this happen in a way that creates those jobs that someone like Gary says haven't been delivered? And so, in a sense, I find today quite a depressing day because of what Sunak did, but I'm incredibly excited about the kind of positive opportunities we have as a country, and I think one shouldn't lose that. And just to be sort of, maybe not a likely thing for me to say, I think this is something that Boris Johnson did get, by the way. I mean, say what you like quite a lot about Boris Johnson, but he did get this point that this was the future, and I think this is my point about Sunak. In a way, forget about trust for a second, but if you think about Johnson and May and my former opponent David Cameron, all of them in some way got this, I think, in a way that he didn't. He doesn't.
You mentioned your 2030 plan for green electricity and talking to business about it. Well, we talked to business about it, and they all say it's impossible. Nobody thinks you can do this.
Just like people said you couldn't develop a vaccine in 18 months. Just like people said Germany couldn't build an LNG terminal in 9 months. I mean, we've got to get out of impossible, the idea of everything being impossible in this country, and we've got to have some ambition. I tell you what, if we have, as Keir has said, as one of his 5 missions, and this is why I'm so proud it's one of Keir's 5 missions, a laser focus on making this 2030 plan happen, with business, with departments being joined up, with GB Energy, with a willingness to invest through the National Wealth Fund, breaking down the barriers to what I call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: planning, skills, supply chains, and grid. Absolutely, we can achieve this. Look, the government's got a 2035 target. They want to get to 95% clean energy by 2030. Nobody believes they're going to do that because they've got no proper focus, no proper plan. That's, in a way, the point about today. This is the sort of chickens coming home to roost somewhat, in the sense that they haven't had the plan in an area like boilers and heat pumps. But we're going to have the plan, and we're going to do it.
You've talked a lot about having a plan, and I understand why in opposition it's important to have a set plan. You had a plan, £28 billion a year. Now that plan seems to be moving a little bit away from what we'd originally expected. So it's not quite as clear from Labour as
I think it's a reflection of 2 things, and we've said this, Rachel and I have said this, which is, look, first of all, you can't deliver £28 billion in year 1 anyway. And secondly, we have to respond to the fiscal situation we find ourselves in. And look, by anyone's measure, as we were saying just before we started, getting to a £28 billion a year investment in the second half of the Parliament, which we'll do, is a very sizable investment. It can make a big difference in areas from home insulation to generating jobs for Britain to driving forward with some of the new technologies that are going to be important for us. And creating jobs and wealth for Britain. So, we're absolutely committed to it. And I've got to say, if we win the election, we will have in Keir and Rachel a more committed Prime Minister and Chancellor on this agenda than at any time in our history. I know that from my many, many discussions we have over these issues.
You were saying to me just before that the 28 billion was not incomparable to what President Biden's doing in the US. But I mean, the state of the US economy versus the state of the UK economy is not really comparable. Can we really do Bidenomics here? Is that really going to be credible? And are people in the UK really going to buy that we can do what he's doing?
I think people want ambition. Look, in a way, it goes to a wider political question, which is how do you assess people's mood? And I think people's mood is a sense of a question, I suppose, which is, can anyone address the crises we face as a country, the cost of living crisis, the long-term economic crisis, and indeed the climate crisis? And, I think what is very important and admirable about Keir and Rachel, and I think this is underestimated, is the extent to which they are determined to be ambitious for the country about what can be achieved. So I don't think we should sort of, think, oh, well, Britain can't do this. I mean, of course, America is a bigger country, and, they can sort of focus more broadly than we can, and we've got to play to our strengths. But we have enormous strengths, Jack. Carbon capture and storage in the North Sea, hydrogen, offshore wind, which was a strength, and it still is a strength, but, obviously the recent auction is a big, big problem. So I think it needs a government that's going to work with business to just actually exploit these strengths.
Let me take a couple of questions from the room. We've got some coming in through on my very high-tech app here. This
Impressive.
Well, I can read it off a screen anyway. Someone asking about the boiler subsidies. Biden in the IRA scheme is offering, it says here, although I haven't checked this, $2,000, and Rishi Sunak's scheme is over 4 times more generous. Are you going to go even higher, or is
Look,
Rishi got it right?
I go back to what I said, which is that, look, we will set out a plan to make this work for the country. I think part of the problem about the boiler upgrades...
It's a bit vague, though, isn't it?
No, we'll look, you know, give us a bit of time. He just announced his policy today, or his new policy. Look, we will set out a plan at the election to make this happen and to make the heat pump market succeed in a way that it hasn't succeeded. Part of the problem has been not just the scale of the grant, but the number of the sort of cap on the number of people it's gone to. Although actually, it's sort of take-up hasn't been great either. But I think what people want is not just a one-off announcement; they want a proper plan, and we'll have that.
Another one here. Shouldn't we be more ambitious on our path to net zero? Starmer was in France yesterday, where they banned some domestic flights to encourage train use.
Look, I'm about carrots, not sticks. I think that...
I bet you hate domestic flights, Ed.
No, look, I'm about...
I bet you do. We wouldn't take a helicopter down to a press conference in Southampton.
I wouldn't take a helicopter to a press conference, but look, I think that people will come with us, and the way the economics has changed and the way the opportunities have changed, you know, I used to say this as climate change secretary, you know, Martin Luther King didn't say, I have a nightmare. He said, I have a dream. And, you know, I think it's about, there is a positive story, and this is what I think gets me about what Sunak was doing today. There is a positive story about how the country can change. We can have better transport. We can have cleaner air. We can have good jobs at decent wages. We can have lower bills. We can have well-insulated homes. So, you know, what I am interested in is showing people the positive vision that there is for the future. This isn't just about an obligation to be managed. This is about an opportunity for Britain.
We talked a little bit about the US and President Biden. I wanted to talk about China as well, because obviously they're a huge player in this whole debate. What do you say to people who say that we shouldn't be engaging at all with China as a power?
Look, I think you have to engage with them. I mean, you have to call them out on really, really important human rights issues, and you have to be kind of aware of the national security issues in relation to China. But obviously, you have to engage with them. I've, you know, spent 15 years in different ways engaging with China on climate. You know, they are absolutely central to any solutions. I mean, I think one of the things that's important to say is China is by no means doing everything right in relation to climate. But when you look at what is happening, this is what's happening. I think this is quite an important reason to be optimistic, by the way. When you look at what is happening, for example, to solar installation in China, I think I'm right in saying that they're installing more solar in the coming year than the US has solar. You know, it's like the scale of what China is doing on this. And this is because of this central fact, which I think is the biggest thing, apart from the climate crisis being here and real and happening now, the biggest change compared to when I was climate change secretary 15 years ago is what's happened to the economics. You know, the economics has transformed. The fact that the cost of solar is down 89% in a decade, the fact that the cost of wind are down 60% in a decade, the fact that for 90% of the world, new renewables are cheaper than new fossil fuels. This is the biggest transformation that we've seen. And I actually think that is the biggest reason to be optimistic, because I think you know, this can be transformative and we can go faster than people think.
But if you think strategically, there's a potential problem there. Someone's raising it on here. Look, they say, isn't net zero basically going to make us as dependent on Beijing for green tech as Europe was on Moscow for gas?
It doesn't
need to.
But
huge amounts of solar panels come from China.
It doesn't need, well, I know it doesn't need to, but that's why we need to diversify our supply chains. And look, I was with Heather Boucher from the Council of Economic Advisors last week at an event, and I know Heather well, and you know, one of the things we were discussing is, look, what is the work we can do together if Labour is in government on diversifying the supply chains that we have? It's look, this is a really, really important part of what we need to be doing, and you know, the way Europe was exposed to Russia's gas is a real warning about that.
Keir Starmer said, in fact, on the podcast we're publishing tomorrow, we need to wean ourselves off Chinese influence. Does that apply to solar panels as much as it does
to... Of course we need to diversify our supply chains. Absolutely, he's right about that.
Okay, all right. A couple more on this, and then I just want to ask you a couple of questions about your own self and your own career. One more from the audience. How are renewables cheaper with sustainable aviation fuel being 2 to 8 times more expensive than jet fuel? Do you buy the whole sustainable aviation?
I think sustainable aviation fuels is part of the answer, definitely. And look, you see, this is the thing which is really important to say is a very sort of well-known energy economist who shall remain nameless wrote, I think in 2014, that offshore wind would never be cost competitive with gas, and he was wrong. A former Prime Minister who was the Mayor of London I ran into recently said to me, I know, when I saw you when I was Mayor of London and you were Climate Change Secretary, you used to go on about offshore wind. I thought you were talking nonsense. I won't do the impression. And it turned out, it's much cheaper. So something like SAF, we do need investment in SAF because it will bring down the costs. And you see, this is what's interesting about IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. People say, well, it's just America sort of capturing the whole market for themselves. Actually, you need $5 trillion a year of investment, according to the IEA. There's plenty to go around. And actually, America investing in these things is a good thing, not a bad thing, because it will drive down costs. And I think this is the genius of the private sector, with a bit of help from government, so co-investing can help bring these costs down.
Let me ask you about Keir Starmer, because we've been trying to figure out in our office just how green he is. It sometimes has felt that you two haven't always seen eye to eye on everything, although I know you'll tell me that you are exactly on one mind on every single thing. Is he a tree hugger?
I don't think he would describe himself as that. I tell you what, but it's interesting, this. I mean, it's complete nonsense to say somehow that we have a divergence between ourselves. I think what is so striking is Keir so gets this agenda. He is an incredible enthusiast for this agenda. And I think, as he has explained, this story that was written about tree hugger was such nonsense, because actually what he said was, he was talking about steel workers that he and I had gone to visit in Scunthorpe, and they were saying, we need investment in green steel. We need investment in order to make the transformation. Now, they were frustrated about the grid and the grid connection. So, he sees, and this is the way I talk about this, I talk about it in this order, which is bills, security, jobs, and climate. Because that is what action on climate is about. And that is the new world that we're in.
Starmer hasn't eaten meat for about 25 years, he said, because it's the right thing to do for the planet.
I famously ate a bacon sandwich. You may not have known that. So he has done better. He has done better than me, I think it's fair to say, on that score. I don't think he's wanting to impose it on everyone else. I think it's a personal choice.
Do you obviously eat meat, because we remember
Exactly.
the photo. Yeah.
I just thought I would get there first.
Sorry, do you drive an electric vehicle yourself?
I do.
You do? What do you have?
Renault Zoe.
Okay. Has it ever run out on you on the M1 North?
I mean, I think we had sort of range anxiety to begin with, but you spend a lot of time at sort of McDonald's trying to get charged up. But look, I think sorting out the
They're a bit annoying sometimes, right?
Look, sorting out the charging infrastructure is another area where there's been no proper plan. Obviously you need to sort out the charging infrastructure, and the pace and scale needs to completely speed up. And what industry wants is not abandonment of the 2030 phase-out date, but they want action to make this happen, and that's what we would do.
And heat pumps, can you install them in Highgate?
Yes, not yet, but we've got a boiler from 2009. Our next installation will be of a heat pump.
Okay, it's on the list. Fine.
Yeah.
Good, okay. We talked about interviewing you back in 2008. I remember another one speaking to you in 2015, just before the election, when it felt like, to some observers, probably to yourself, you were on the cusp of
It didn't work out that well.
Prime Minister. No, it didn't in the end. How do you process that now? When you look back and think, at that point, and you think about...
It was disappointing.
But all the things that have happened since then in Britain, it's been such a dramatic period since you lost that election.
It would have been much more chaotic with me.
Is it hard to look back on that time and put yourself in the brain of Ed Miliband 2015, thinking, I'm going to change the country?
You know what? I don't actually spend that much time looking back on it. Because I'm genuinely excited about the job I have. I think, everyone in this audience probably knows that, I was passionate about this area when I was climate change and energy secretary. I'm passionate, I remain passionate about this area. I think if I think about my kids, the biggest, when they look back at my career, the biggest question they'll ask is, were you the last generation not to get it or the first generation to get it? The world is burning. We can tackle this problem in a way that it's good for people now and in the future. And I think it's just, I think sort of that mission in government inspires me. So, I don't recommend losing a general election to people if they think about taking up this profession. But, I'm focused on what we can do, not on what might have been.
I'm duty bound to ask you one more about 2015. I do remember you going round to Russell Brand's house for that interview, Ed, 2 weeks before the election.
Yep.
I'm guessing you regret that one now?
Yeah, of course. Look, I think the allegations that have come to light are horrific allegations, and my solidarity is with the women who've come forward to tell their stories. Obviously, I did lots of interviews in that campaign. Russell Brand was going around saying people shouldn't vote. I went and did an interview on his program because I wanted young people to get out and vote. But obviously, knowing what I know now, obviously I regret doing it.
Some people say it shows a lack of judgment. What would you say to that?
I mean, look, hindsight is a wonderful thing. As I say, I did lots and lots of interviews. This was somebody who was gaining notoriety at that point for saying to people, do not vote because it will make no difference. And I felt duty-bound, if there was an opportunity to do so, to say to young people in particular, who he was targeting, say, voting doesn't make a difference. I mean, that it would make a difference. I mean, it was, you will remember the time. I mean, Nick Robinson, who was then the political editor of the BBC, attacked Russell Brand for saying that voting would make no difference. I wanted to do everything I could to say to, as I say, young people in particular, that, it did matter.
Okay, let's talk about the future. You're 18 points ahead in the polls.
I don't believe the opinion polls.
You've been scarred by them before. This is quite a big lead, though. You must be starting to measure up the curtains,
Definitely
looking
not.
round Desnes, thinking, yeah, I could see myself back in
Definitely
here.
not.
Get the old gang back together.
Definitely not. Look, I am. Tony Blair used to say I'm the eternal. He was the eternal warrior against complacency, and that is completely right. No election is decided until the votes have been cast. I'm sure Keir would, is the first person to say that. I think the country is fed up with the Conservatives, 13 years of the Conservatives, but as Keir himself says, it's part of our challenge, as any opposition is to say, if not them, why us? And that's what our conference is going to be about, and that's why I'm so excited about this agenda, because it helps in my area to answer the question, if not them, why us?
And I'm sorry to hark back to this one more time, but you've been here before. Have you got advice to Keir on being in front of the polls, coming into an election? What can you?
My advice. Look, my only advice to Keir has always been be yourself. I think that's the most important thing in any job, and I think Keir is somebody of the utmost decency and integrity and values, and I've known him a long time, and I think that's what's showing actually. He will be a brilliant Prime Minister of the country if we win the election. So I think he doesn't really need my advice. I think he's doing great.
Just one more. The Climate Change Committee says the UK needs a climate envoy, a bit like John Kerry in the US. Do you think that's a good idea? And can you think of any sort of greying-haired elder statesman who might be well suited to the swanning round the world
What's the
job?
climate envoy going to do? What's the job description?
Fly around the world talking about the climate at big conferences, I think. It looks pretty sweet.
I think there's a sort of serious point here, which is perhaps goes back to where we started, which is I think Rishi Sunak wants to break the climate consensus in this country. There are lots of Conservatives who don't agree with him, as we've seen in the last 24 hours. Whether I'm in opposition and if I'm in government, I will want to work with those people. I'm not offering them a job, but whether it's Alok Sharma or Chris Skidmore or others, I am determined, and this goes across not just parties but business and unions and others. I think Keir uses the phrase, the word mission advisedly. It's not just a slogan. This is a national mission for Britain. And a national mission needs people from all sectors, but it also needs people from all parties as well. And they might try and break the climate consensus, and if they lose the election, no doubt, it will be a competition to see who can be the biggest climate culture warrior. That will be for them. if I'm in government, I'll be working with people right across the political spectrum. I think it's really, really important.
Is there a role for Boris Johnson in that?
I'm not sure. I don't think not quite that. I'm not quite there. But not quite there. But I think there are lots of Conservatives who care about this issue, and indeed other parties. And there isn't a monopoly of wisdom. Alok and I don't. I hope quite bad for him this, but Alok and I talk quite a bit. Because I think he's got really smart things to say. I think Chris Skidmore's review had really important things to say. You know, goodness, this is such a big challenge. I want to work with people from across parties.
All right, Ed Miliband, almost but not quite offering a job to Boris Johnson there if Labour wins power. Thank you very much for that, Ed. Thank you. I've just got to thank our partners as well, SSE, for their support. Thank you for everyone for being in the room today, everyone watching online as well. We have a busy autumn of events at Politico. Have a look on our website. We do things like this all the time. And we have a ton of booze in the back, so please stick around. Come and say hello. The night is but young. We may see some more government U-turns when the papers drop. Who knows? So anyway, thank you very much, and thank you, Ed. Cheers.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower